LGBTQIA. Who are you? Where did you come from? Are you someone other than the names you are called or the names you give yourself? Where do these names come from? Are they yours? Are they yours in the sense that they belong to you like objects and you are someone separate from them who then possesses them, as a belonging separate from yourself, like your shoes? Are they labels attached to you but not you? Or do they go all the way down? Did you make them up yourself, or did they make you up? Are these names in fact the very constitution of you, making you even as they are spoken? Are names inescapable if you wish to be anything at all? Or is there a you that you can find somewhere else, turning away from these names, maybe some deep interior being? Or a sense of there being that, in a language without words, if that makes sense? Can there be this self, existing apart from the labels, apart from the shoes you walk in? Is this the individual, unsullied? Can the individual exist without any sort of social definition? Or is the individual nothing, a self that likes carrots but not cheese, without carrots and cheese? What is your gay self, your lesbian self, your queer self? What is this creature? Where is this creature? Does the hat fit or not? How comfortable are you? Is identity the new fashion? Must everybody have one? Or are these identities the anti-fashion, a little tired? What if we don't like the off-the-peg availabilities? Who can afford a tailor? We are what is about us. Women know this. One is not a duchess 100 yards from a carriage. A man wrote that in America in about 1917. I like the way it glues the self to things. I am not a duchess without a carriage, and anyhow I am a princess. Maybe some footman and a tiara would help. Today, on the Aquericon, we're going to consider the queerness of identity. Identity itself. Is it a non-existent rabbit in a hat? I am, in some sense, probably, Russell Christie, and this is the Aquericon. In the 1980s, I was a gay man. In the 1980s, I became a gay man. I was a gay man. I became a gay man. I am trying these on for size. Was I born or invented? Even here there's some confusion. Am I still a gay man now? And what's that got to do with me? Is there any need for me to define as a gay man, now that society has changed, at least here in the UK? Do I become gay again if I step into Russia, for example? So, in the 1980s, I was a gay man. I felt my identity. I had it like a solid thing inside of me, something that was definitely me, not an inflection made by society, but the central, eternal core of who I was, where I was. I identified. Civil rights movements of the 20th century were founded on feelings of identity. The women's civil rights movement, the black civil rights movement, and the gay civil rights movement. These were driven by identifications, identification of the self with others, in which your own identity meant an identity with others. In its very structure, identity implies that you are not yourself. Identity cannot be individual. Identity is this crossing over. It means the same as, not apart from. To have an identity is not to be alone. Only the individual is alone. Having your own identity is incoherent, because identity and individuality are mutually exclusive. Unless that identity is so compact, it is absolutely withdrawn from the social. This is the modern tension. The current trumpeting of absolutely individual identities has a lonely tension because it makes no sense. When I hear the brainwashing mantra, "Well, we're all individuals," I shudder. You speak for yourself. You may be an individual. I'm certainly not. The individual is outside the fold of humanity. Poor lamb. To be an individual is to be without belonging. Unfortunately, I think, there are a lot of people who have been programmed to be in that state at the moment, and this makes a new state, which they then band together in. That gives me the heebie-jeebies. The individual is the sociopath, with no identity and no allegiance. A society of free individuals is a society in which the sociopathic is legitimate, whereas identity and identifying with is empathy, a laying the self out through and with the categories of others into a common space. A compact identity, of the black hole sort, is to take arms against all others and define the self as absolute opposition. And that may then be the greatest inhibition, the denial of all identities in an individuality without categories. This is death. This individuality is the extremist form of alienation. It's what happens when categories of being are denied, devalued, and negated. L, G, B, T, Q, I, A. Pure subjectivity is where people live when all the things in the world become mere objects for them. This is the realm of shopping. Individual subjectivity is where people live when both consumer goods and other people become separate things. This is why the mantra of our current economy is invested in individualism. If you believe you are an individual, this is a political event. You have been indoctrinated and acculturated. In this indoctrination, the people who are absolutely without freedom are the apolitical. They are the ghosts of life, imprisoned in detachment by the pervasive propaganda of economics. Even the science of neoliberal economies, what is considered to be true, is invested in particle physics rather than field theories. Particles exist, they shout, the fundamental independent entities, just like people. There were, of course, only 3 things wrong with the declaration of the supposed discovery of the God particle, the Higgs boson, if you remember, in 2012. First of all, as you probably guessed, it wasn't God. Secondly, it wasn't a particle. And thirdly, they hadn't found it. So much for science. Individuality is propaganda, and so is definition. So what does it mean to be queer? Are queers individuals? Or is the queer these days the anti-individual? I was a member of Queer Nation in San Francisco in 1990. Queer Nation was an activist group that pulled together gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual and straight people to form resistance and fight for civil rights under the umbrella term queer. Queer then was not a category of otherness to everything, not a category of otherness to identity and settled identities, but an umbrella term, a patchwork to include and bring into a single force all those who were considered weird or illegitimate or abnormal in some way, in any way. The queer was not a denial of identity, but an inclusive name for all who had identities that were denied by the mainstream, anyone gay, bisexual, transgender, lesbian, or weirdly straight. Everyone's having an identity was taken for granted, and the queer en masse was a coming together in challenge and political activism. We knew exactly who we were. We were identified and bound together by queer, not disidentified by the term. Great America is a theme park to the south of San Francisco. It has the usual roller coaster rides, funfair sideshows and restaurants littered about between recreated versions of the American landscape and the American dream. One day, a coachload of Queer Nation soldiers, like the Salvation Army, drove down from San Francisco to visit Great America. I have nostalgia now for the community of our cause, the heady days of activism and injustice. And I pity myself also for the youthful ignorances, fear, and indoctrinations which prevented me from appreciating the full glory of it. But we were in a fight for our lives. The gay men of San Francisco were dying in their swathes. I had naively run away from Nottingham to San Francisco as a gay mecca. The members of Queer Nation coupled up for the day to roam around the theme park holding hands, challenging the heteronormativity of Great America. I was a 25-year-old, crew-cut-headed, policeman-looking, square-dressing white guy in shorts and T-shirt. My partner for the day was a dazzling, slim, tall, dreadlocked African-American guy in a neon blue bodysuit. Still, today we would be an extraordinary-looking couple. In our interracial homosexuality we combined the two taboos of Great America. The sun was shining, our young skin glowed in it, and we were fresh and tough and righteous. Surprisingly, we passed the day unharassed and unmolested. I still don't know whether this was an anticlimax, or we were perhaps too immense for anyone to challenge, too weird, too handsome, too strong, too fierce. Like Mickey Mouse arm in arm with Cinderella, we were looked at from a distance, and our contraries couldn't be allowed to betray the holiday atmosphere. But when children ran towards us, their parents called them away, especially as we leaned against each other, more brazen in every queue for each roller coaster or railroad ride. Or perhaps we were unharassed because when America becomes a theme park, spectacle is all that counts, so we were allowed to fit right in through the bugbear of tolerance. And, after all, we had paid the entrance fee. A few months later, however, I was chucking railings through the windows of State House in San Francisco when Pete Wilson, the then governor of California, vetoed equality in the workplace legislation in the real America. The police then said political violence was the wrong thing to do. Civil society now says it was a good idea. So, I had an identity then. I was definitely and unquestionably a gay white male. Identifying as gay felt natural. Being white felt natural. And yet both of these were politically driven and political drivers. To a certain extent, maybe totally, I have no control experiment, my gay identity was made purely from the resistance to it. Had other people not been concerned about my behaviour, I wouldn't have become invested in it as a central core which defined me. I wouldn't have run to San Francisco. The more I was railed or bullied or legislated against, the more my identity felt real, and mine. But what happens to this inwardly experienced identity when opposition ends? Does it still remain? Or does it evaporate by this permission? Is it diluted? Is to hold on to it to stay in a prison of the past? And yet, if you don't hold on to it, Who are you? Did you see that article a couple of months back based on interviews with 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK about how they identified sexually? According to this survey, most 18 to 24-year-olds don't want to embrace a fixed sexual identity, don't consider themselves to have one, or don't wish to be defined by one. Why should they impose on themselves, or cling to, any sort of restriction or circumscription? Why should they even begin to think of themselves as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or even straight? And heaven help us that the masters of the universe should be required to define themselves as anything restricted. What do these definitions matter? Nothing should be denied the new seekers, even to themselves, by historic, misguided prejudices and forms of restriction. All people are people unfixed, to which any form of behaviour is available. Identities need not be clung to. Sexual fluidity is all. Identity in that department is a thing of the past. I don't know whether I hear phobia in this, or liberation, or a desperation for freedom which is in itself self-defeating, because freedom can never be found in denial. Denial is a confinement to the world of ghosts. Freedom is never a turning away, but always a turning toward everything, an embracing of every category. The only differences I hear are between the voices of those who want to define and the voices of those who don't want to define, in embracings or denials of self-definition. The conceptual way in which others are embraced is the formation of the self. Your mind is what appears in other people's flesh, or not. So, we've gone from a time in which identity politics and sexual identities were central and felt very real. Or hang on, let me own that. I've gone from a time in which my sexual identity as a gay man felt real and strong and central, to a time in which my identity has evaporated due to its acceptance. I was made by history, as I still am, as you now are. Society no longer has an issue with me. I am no longer a gay man. I feel bereft. What was the problem all along? And where did it go? Where did identity go? Are we living in a time in which nobody has any identity anymore? Except maybe as a leftover ritual, a manipulation of empty symbols, with no significance to appearance or behaviour, nothing to be inferred from it, like those bearded hipsters who've never actually read Ginsberg? Is identity now made around what you can and cannot buy, and this is who you are, no matter what your race, gender, and sexuality? Your purchasing power is the definition of you. Identifying with others belongs to purchasable labels. Money is the only identity, and that through which we identify in status or consumer choices. Was this the equality the civil rights movements were striving for? The equal assimilation of all identities to a financial marker of who each of us is, essentially? And yet, take a look at the university LGBT societies and the Nottingham Outburst Youth Group. They have treasurers and presidents and social coordinators and welfare rights workers and lots of members who do patently identify as LGBT. When I was 20 and tried with a couple of others to form a gay and lesbian youth group in Nottingham, we had difficulty finding 3 other gay and lesbian people. There weren't people around, apparently, who identified so far as to join a social group. And yet now, when I switch on Grindr, gay men bloom like daffodils as I walk along the street. Technology makes homosexuals. How do you identify? How do you hook up with identity? And what are your ambitions? I have been Russell Christie, and this has been the Aquericon. If you'd like to buy some more of me, dear consumers, my novel, The Queer Diary of Mordred Vienna, is available from Five Leaves Bookshop, Rough Trade, and Ideas on Paper in the city. Or find me online. And remember, the inability to form an identity experience may itself be a manifestation of the uncertainties that are manufactured by the individuating totalization of a consumer capital economy. Perhaps you'd be better to join the Shady Cow Collective.